Joining me for Culture Wars is Rowan Dean, author, editor of The Spectator Australia, presenter of Outsiders on Sunday mornings, and right now is protecting himself by also Skyping it in. Rowan, I tell you what, looking at that picture and compared to the one from Singapore, and a beautiful picture as well on Skype from Canada that we had the other day, our internet's got a long way to go. But how come you're Skyping?
That's the NBN. That's Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd's NBN for you. We spent 40 billion or something on it. We should have just let Optus and Telstra do it anyway, which is what some of us were saying way, way back then. Andrew, I think we've all got to do our bit. I think that's critical. This is a very simple numbers game. I was saying, a couple of weeks ago, why aren't we banning crowds? Why aren't we stopping people or closing our borders and saying to people who are coming in, you've got to go for 2 weeks quarantine? I was saying that 2 weeks ago. Last Sunday, I was getting scoffed at for saying that, and people saying, no, that's ridiculous, that's overreaction. And here we are a couple of days later, and that's the situation we're in. Because it's a very simple logic. It's not hard to understand the logic of this coronavirus, and that is that the more we do now sooner, the much easier it will be to get on top of it and defeat it. You actually gave at the beginning of the show, Andrew, a very encouraging story about the Diamond Princess. And the point about the Diamond Princess, Andrew, is that those people on that boat were all in lockdown, all fully aware of what the dangers were, all fully aware that they had to scrub their hands, not bump into each other with social distancing. All of this stuff, the decks were the handrails, the doorknobs were being wiped down every 5 seconds. So the Diamond Princess is actually the story of what countries need to do. And it's what Singapore is doing. It's what Japan, it's what Taiwan have done successfully. These countries that were exposed to SARS a decade ago in a bad way know exactly what it takes to defeat this. So it's not surprising to see that those countries are getting on top of it quickly. We're kind of falling between. Hopefully we won't be as bad as Italy because we've got on top of it that much quicker. And in fact, on Sunday, I was saying we still have a 2-week opportunity to avoid going down Italy's path, and that's what Italians were telling us. I think we've done that. I think 90% of that we're there, and I think Scott Morrison today really brought the gravity of this thing home. Now, as for whether people go on Skype or stay at home, the single most critical thing is just to reduce the amount of social interaction. If we're all doing it in whatever way we possibly can, so by not going into the studio this evening, I'm avoiding half a dozen people that I would otherwise come into close contact with. They're avoiding me, and hopefully that's my little bit for the day. But it's only when we all do that little bit that we get on top of it.
And I should point out, you have a doctor in the family, so you're probably well informed, better informed than most. On the Diamond Princess, I must say, you make a very good point. On the other hand, this virus is extremely contagious before symptoms manifest itself. So True. It was around the ship before they did the lockdown. Who knows how
Absolutely.
widespread. But yeah, you do make a point. Now, but Rowan, to the way I started this, it seems to me a pretty sad reflection of where we are when the Prime Minister has to lecture Australians, and I thought quite appropriately, for acting like absolute ferals in this crisis. What do you make of all that?
I agree very much with that, Andrew. I think there's two things, and it's important to separate the two things. Prime Minister Scott Morrison made the point about abusing people in shops and being rude to staff is just grotesque. We know that. We've seen that in other situations where you should never, ever take out your frustrations on the people who are just doing their job and trying to do the job to the best of their ability in a difficult circumstance. The hoarding thing fascinates me, Andrew, because as a firm believer in the free market principles and the laws of demand and supply, it doesn't bother me because you're going to find in about 6 weeks or sooner or later thousands of people with garages stuffed with toilet paper that they've got no idea what to do with. And the price of toilet paper, Andrew, will have gone literally through the floor because there's more and more supply coming onto the market. I don't think, unless I've completely misunderstood this virus, and I haven't, I don't think there's any increase in demand for the function of toilet paper. Therefore, we are going to have an oversupply and the price is going to go through the floor, and all the people who thought they would profit out of it are actually going to end up losing money, and they will realize that very, very quickly. So I'm not really bothered about the idea of people going in and out and buying stuff or whatever. In fact, at the supermarket only yesterday, a guy in Coles, they were saying, well, you can't have, you can only buy two bits of whatever it was, chicken or something like that. So there's plenty of options for the supermarkets to control that. Where it is repulsive, and Scott Morrison was right to call it out, is this, people crashing into each other with shopping trolleys, stealing toilet rolls from blind people, and all this stuff is repugnant and repulsive, and he was right to call it out firmly.
Well, I'm glad that a lot of them will be doomed to eating their big cases of baked beans for the rest of the year.
Well, that's where the toilet
May
paper might come in handy.
flatulence strike them. Exactly. I want to show you an interesting
carbon
graphic.
Emissions, Andrew.
Yeah, well, oh, no, we can't have that. No naked lights. I want to show you an interesting graphic, Rowan, that about a phenomenon that I mentioned to the previous guest. Shows a cultural difference that I think is really interesting. Japan, South Korea and Chinese countries, like Confucian countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, also Taiwan, which is not shown on this graphic. They're in the blue lines there. They have all done better than anyone else in flattening that curve. Even China did after a slow start. That's the yellow. Although Australia isn't doing too badly there. It's bottom left in the grey, in the middle between the two things. That seems to me to show a cultural difference in obeying norms, set by a government, which obviously is not always great, but maybe a little bit more discipline, maybe more of a sense of community.
I think all of those things are true, Andrew, and the Confucian culture, the Chinese culture has always been about taking care of the elderly, respect for the elderly. It's also always been about, where possible, hygiene. Go to Singapore, there it is, manifest the, you can eat, I wouldn't advise it, but you can probably eat your dinner off half those pavements there. Everything's scrubbed
Wouldn't
so
do that
clean.
now,
But
not now.
don't do it. I would not advise it. Unfortunately, if you go to the back streets of China, it's a very, very different story. But as I said earlier, the message in those graphs is, those countries, Singapore, Taiwan and others, since SARS, have recognised the importance of a health system that is built to overcapacity. Whereas we, Australia, the NHS is a joke in Britain. And that is why Britain is floundering, and that is why Britain is in such a mess, because the NHS, built as the great ideal of a socialised social welfare hospital system, cannot cope when you have open borders and you let as many people come into your country to use your hospital facilities. So Britain is now suffering because of that.
I agree. And now we're hearing from their medical experts that if they keep the death toll over the next few months to 20,000, they will have done extremely well. Rowan Dean, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.